Welcome, traveler. You've found your way to this quiet corner of the night, where stories whisper and shadows stretch. I am the storyteller, and tonight, I'll guide you into a world of mystery and dreams. I know many of you come here to unwind, to let your mind drift as sleep slowly takes over. So before we begin, take a deep breath, and if you enjoy these stories, don't forget to like this video and subscribe. It helps keep the stories alive. Tell me, where are you watching from, and what time is it? I love knowing how far my voice reaches in the silence of the night. Now, settle in, close your eyes, and let the story begin. My name is Nathan Reed. I was 27 when I took my first trip to Thailand, eager to explore a country I'd only ever seen in travel blogs and YouTube vlogs. I'd spent months saving up, reading about the best street food stalls, hidden temples, and the vibrant chaos of Bangkok's nightlife. Traveling alone had always been my thing. No schedules to follow, no compromises to make. Just me and the world. Bangkok hit me like a wave the moment I stepped out of Suvarnabhumi Airport. The thick, humid air clung to my skin, carrying the scent of spices, car exhaust, and something faintly sweet. Taxis and tuk-tuks zipped through the streets, their horns blaring, neon lights reflecting off rain-slicked pavement. It was everything I'd hoped for, alive, chaotic, beautiful. I took a shuttle to Khao San Road, the backpacker's haven I'd read about. My hotel was nothing fancy, just a modest 3-story place with a flickering neon sign. The receptionist barely looked up as he handed me my key. The room was small but clean, with a stiff bed and a window overlooking the crowded street below. Perfect. I dropped my backpack on the bed, changed into something lighter, and headed out, eager to experience Bangkok at night. The air smelled of sizzling meat, chili, and something fried. Street vendors lined the roads, their carts filled with skewers of chicken, pork, and things I couldn't quite identify. Music thumped from nearby bars, blending into the sounds of laughter and conversation. I was halfway through a plate of pad thai from a street stall when I noticed a piece of paper taped to the vendor's cart. The edges were curled, stained from exposure to the elements. It was a missing person flyer. A young man, maybe a few years older than me, smiling in the grainy photo. Missing. Last seen near Khao San Road. Any information, please contact authorities. I stared at it for a moment, my stomach twisting slightly, but quickly shook it off. Big city, people go missing all the time. Probably a tourist who got lost, partied too hard, or maybe just decided to disappear for a while. The vendor must have noticed me looking because he said something in Thai to his wife before turning back to me. Tourist, he said, his voice low, his English heavily accented. Stay careful. I raised an eyebrow. Why? He glanced at the flyer, then at the busy street behind me. His wife muttered something in Thai, and he hesitated before speaking again. Some people disappear. There was something in the way he said it, like he knew more than he was letting on. I let out a small laugh, trying to brush off the unease creeping up my spine. I'll be fine, just here to have a good time. The vendor didn't smile. Instead, he handed me my change and nodded toward the flyer. Be careful. I pocketed the money and turned back toward the street. The missing person's face still lingered in my mind, but I wasn't going to let paranoia ruin my first night in Thailand. What were the chances it had anything to do with me? The night was alive, pulsing with music and laughter as I wandered into a bar just off Khao San Road. Inside, a mix of locals and tourists filled the dimly lit space, their conversations blending into the rhythmic beat of Thai pop music. I squeezed through the crowd and found a spot at the bar, ordering a Chong beer and taking a moment to soak in the atmosphere. That was when I first saw her. She stood with a small group near the back, dark hair cascading over her shoulder, a confident smile, and eyes that carried an unreadable depth. She was beautiful in a way that didn't try too hard, dressed in a loose silk blouse and jeans, effortlessly blending and yet standing out all the same. She must have caught me looking because, within minutes, she was next to me. You're new here, she said, her voice smooth, slightly teasing. I laughed. That obvious? She tilted her head playfully. A little. What's your name? Nathan. I'm Lila. She clinked her glass against mine. First time in Bangkok? I nodded. Yeah, just got in today. Then you need someone to show you the real Bangkok, she said, her smile widening. Not just Khao San Road. That was how it started. Lila introduced me to her friends, an eclectic group of expats and locals, speaking a mix of English, Thai, and other languages I couldn't place. There was Daniel from France, who had been traveling through Southeast Asia for months. May, a sharp-witted woman from Hong Kong, and a few others whose names I didn't quite catch in the chaos of the music and drinks. The conversation was effortless, the drinks kept coming, and for the first time that night, I felt less like a tourist and more like I belonged. You're cool, Nathan, Lila said at one point, leaning in slightly. Not like the usual backpackers. Yeah, I grinned. And what are the usual backpackers like? She rolled her eyes. Drunk, loud, sunburned. I laughed. I'll try not to be any of those things. A few hours and several drinks later, Lila leaned close again. Hey, we're heading to a place not many people know about. A hidden gem. A bar. I asked. She smiled. Something better. An after-hours party. Private venue. I hesitated, the words of the street vendor from earlier echoing in my mind. Some people disappear. As if sensing my hesitation, Lila placed a hand on my arm. You'll love it, she assured me. Trust me. I looked around at the others. They were all nodding, excited, ready to go. This wasn't just some scam to lure in drunk tourists. These were people who looked like they knew the city, like they'd done this before. All right, I said finally. Let's do it. As we stepped out of the bar, I noticed a man standing near the entrance. He was Thai, maybe in his 40s, dressed in a simple button-down and jeans. He wasn't doing anything, just watching. His gaze lingered on our group, his expression unreadable. I frowned but shook it off. Paranoia. Just another guy enjoying the night. Lila linked her arm with mine as we walked down the street. It's not far, she said. We'll take a taxi. She pulled out her phone, and within seconds, a cab pulled up. That was fast. I hesitated again. Something about how quickly it arrived made me uneasy. But what was I supposed to say? That I had a bad feeling? That the street vendor's warning was making me paranoid? Lila opened the door and slid inside first, pulling me in beside her. The others followed, laughing and chatting as if nothing was out of the ordinary. I told myself I was just overthinking it. After all, what were the chances that anything was really wrong? The taxi pulled away from Khao San Road, weaving through the congested streets of Bangkok. At first, it felt like any other ride. Laughter in the car, city lights flickering past the windows, the warm night air pressing against my skin. But then, things began to change. I leaned against the window, watching as the lively chaos of the city gave way to quieter, unfamiliar streets. The neon signs and bustling bars thinned out, replaced by dimly lit roads, shuttered storefronts, and abandoned-looking buildings. I frowned. Where are we going? No one answered at first, too caught up in their own conversations. I turned to Lila, who was scrolling through her phone, her face illuminated by the screen's glow. Lila, I asked again. She looked up, her expression relaxed. Don't worry, she said smoothly. Just a little further. It's a hidden spot, not on any tourist maps. I glanced at the driver, an older Thai man with deep lines etched into his face. He hadn't spoken once since we got in. Hey, I said louder this time, leaning forward. Where exactly are we going? The driver didn't respond. He didn't even acknowledge me. His hands stayed firm on the wheel, his eyes locked on the road ahead. That was when I realized something was wrong. The city was gone now. No more lights, no more crowds, just long stretches of dark alleyways and industrial buildings. The only sound was the low hum of the engine and the occasional murmur of conversation behind me. A slow, creeping unease coiled in my stomach. I turned back to Lila. This doesn't feel right. She smiled. Relax, Nathan. You're too tense. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out a small bottle. I barely had time to react before she handed me a drink, a can of beer already opened. Here, she said, her voice honey smooth. Drink. Enjoy. I hesitated. My gut screamed at me not to take it, but the eyes of everyone in the car were on me now. They were waiting, watching. If I refused, I'd look paranoid. Overdramatic. And maybe that's all this was, just a weird, out-of-the-way bar. I swallowed hard and took a sip. The taste was off. Slightly bitter, slightly sweet, like something had been mixed in. I tried to set the can down, but Lila reached over, her fingers grazing mine. "Finish it," she said softly. I forced another sip before placing it in the cup holder. And then, things started to shift. The streetlights outside blurred, smearing across the window like streaks of paint. My arms felt heavy. My heartbeat, once steady, now thudded in my ears like a distant drum. I blinked hard, trying to clear my vision. The conversations in the car had slowed, their voices now deep and distorted, stretching unnaturally. Something was wrong. I turned to Lila, struggling to form words. "I think something's..." She just watched me, calm, smiling. My limbs went numb. The world tilted. The last thing I saw before everything faded was her face, still watching, still smiling. And then, darkness. I woke to the feeling of cold metal beneath me. My head throbbed, my mouth was dry, and my limbs wouldn't move. Panic set in fast. My breathing turned shallow as I tried to sit up, but something held me down. My wrists and ankles burned as I yanked against thick leather straps binding me to the bed. Where am I? The air was heavy with the sharp, sterile scent of antiseptic, but beneath it, something foul lingered. Something metallic, something unmistakable. Blood. My vision adjusted to the dim, eerie glow of red emergency lights along the ceiling. The room was vast but quiet, except for the occasional weak moan that made my stomach turn. I wasn't alone. A row of metal beds stretched into the shadows, each occupied by an unmoving figure. Some were restrained like me, their chests barely rising and falling. Others weren't moving at all. I swallowed back bile and twisted my wrist, trying to free myself. The leather was thick, tight. My pulse pounded in my ears. Then I saw it. At the foot of my bed, clipped to a rusted metal frame, was a clipboard. The paper was slightly stained, the ink clinical and cold. Name: Nathan Reed. Age: 27. Health status: optimal. Blood type: O+. Harvest status: pending. My stomach dropped. Harvest? My eyes darted to the side. A tray stood next to me, gleaming under the dull light. Surgical instruments, scalpels, syringes, clamps, all neatly arranged. My breathing quickened. No. A door hissed open. Footsteps. Slow. Measured. Then, out of the shadows, a figure emerged. A man in blood-stained scrubs, wearing a surgical mask, his gloved hands pristine despite the red streaks drying on his sleeves. His eyes were sharp, intelligent. He stopped beside my bed, looking down at me with mild interest, like I was nothing more than a piece of livestock being evaluated. "Ah, you're awake." His voice was smooth, unnervingly calm. "That's unfortunate." I struggled against the restraints, the leather biting into my skin. "What the hell is this? Let me go." The man sighed, tilting his head slightly. Nathan Reed, American tourist. A perfect candidate. Young, healthy, no pre-existing conditions. He tapped the clipboard with a gloved finger. "Oh, positive blood, universal donor. That's valuable." My chest heaved. "Please," I gasped. "You don't have to do this." He ignored me, picking up a syringe from the tray. "We prefer our subjects unconscious during extraction, but I'm afraid the sedatives are rationed these days. If you cooperate, I'll make it painless." I thrashed violently. No, please." His eyes flickered with mild irritation. "I'd suggest you stay still," he said coolly. "Struggling will only make this harder for you." Tears burned my eyes. "You don't have to do this. I have money. I'll give you anything, just..." The man exhaled, shaking his head as if he'd heard it all before. "This isn't personal, Nathan. It's just business." He uncapped the syringe, tapping it lightly. The clear liquid inside glistened under the red glow of the lights. I thrashed harder, my screams bouncing off the walls. The last thing I saw was the needle approaching my arm. Then, darkness. The doctor's cold fingers brushed against my arm, positioning the needle. I struggled, but the restraints held firm. Then, a thunderous crash echoed from beyond the room, followed by frantic shouting in Thai. The doctor flinched, his head snapping toward the door. For a fraction of a second, his grip loosened. It was all I needed. My left wrist, strapped hastily, not as tightly as the others, twisted, muscles straining, fingers reaching. The leather strap dug into my skin, but I ignored the pain. With a desperate jerk, my hand slipped free. The doctor turned back, just in time to see my fist hurtling toward his face. The impact sent him stumbling backward, knocking over the tray of instruments. Metal clattered to the floor, scalpels, forceps, syringes scattering across the blood-stained tiles. Alarms erupted, a shrill, deafening wail. I fought against the remaining restraints, fingers scrambling at the buckles. The leather burned against my skin, but I pulled harder, my pulse a drumbeat of terror. The sounds outside grew more chaotic, hurried footsteps, more shouting. I yanked my legs free just as the doctor lunged forward, hands reaching for my throat. I grabbed the first thing I could, a scalpel from the floor, and slashed blindly. The blade caught his arm. He hissed in pain, stumbling back. I didn't wait. Barefoot, half-dazed from the drugs still in my system, I bolted. I burst into the corridor, my feet slapping against the cold floor. Dim red emergency lights flickered above me, casting long, distorted shadows. Doors lined the hall, some ajar. I caught glimpses inside as I ran. Surgical tables, unconscious bodies, the gleam of stainless steel under fluorescent lights. Then, a room on my right. My stomach twisted. Rows of glass jars filled the shelves. Floating inside, perfectly preserved, were human organs, hearts, livers, kidneys, each one meticulously labeled in Thai and English. I gagged, while rising in my throat. Then, a shout. I turned. Two men stood at the far end of the hallway. Their eyes locked onto me, and in unison, they reached for something under their jackets. Guns. Adrenaline surged. I sprinted, my vision still fuzzy from whatever they had drugged me with. The hallway stretched endlessly, doors blurring past me. A metal cart stood in my path. I shoved it behind me, sending it crashing to the floor. Gunfire erupted. A bullet slammed into the wall inches from my head. I swerved into a side passage, hard hammering. My lungs burned, my body weak from the lingering sedative, but fear kept me moving. A storage room door loomed ahead. I wrenched it open and slipped inside, slamming it shut behind me. Darkness. I crouched behind a stack of metal crates, gripping the scalpel in my shaking hands. My breath came fast, ragged. Outside, footsteps slowed. Then, a voice. Sweet. Almost amused. Nathan. I went rigid. Lila. She was just outside the door, her tone playful, teasing. Come on now, don't make this difficult. I clenched my teeth, pressing myself further into the shadows. My pulse pounded in my ears. She giggled softly, as if this was all some elaborate game. You're special, Nathan. We went through so much trouble for you. I gripped the scalpel tighter. A pause. Then, a slow creak. She was pushing the door open. I held my breath. Seconds stretched into eternity. The light from the hallway spilled into the room, her shadow stretching across the floor. Then, just as suddenly, she sighed. Fine. Have it your way. Her footsteps retreated. I waited, muscles coiled. Then, silence. I exhaled shakily. I moved fast. At the back of the storage room, rusted pipes lined the walls. Beside them, half hidden by shadows, an old maintenance door. I scrambled toward it, fingers fumbling with the latch. It groaned in protest, but didn't budge. Come on, come on. Voices outside. I gritted my teeth and threw my weight against the door. The rusted hinges shrieked. Then, it burst open. Cool night air hit my face. I stumbled into a narrow alley, the stench of garbage and sewage overwhelming. My bare feet slapped against wet pavement as I ran, lungs burning, my head still swimming from the drugs. Behind me, shouts erupted. I didn't look back. I sprinted, weaving through the darkened streets. The neon glow of Bangkok's main roads flickered ahead. Salvation. A row of motorbike taxis stood at the curb, their drivers lounging, smoking, oblivious. I staggered toward the nearest one, grabbing the man's arm. Help me, please. I gasped. The driver's eyes widened at the sight of me, disheveled, barefoot, covered in sweat. Then, More shouts. Lila's voice, smooth and coaxing, somewhere in the distance. Nathan, don't be stupid. The driver glanced past me. His expression darkened. He knew. Without hesitation, he grabbed my arm, yanked me onto the back of his bike, and revved the engine. Then, we were flying into the night. The motorbike weaved through the neon-lit streets of Bangkok, the warm night air whipping against my sweat-soaked skin. My heart pounded, my breath still ragged as I clung to the driver, my mind racing. Had they followed? Had Lila seen where I went? The driver didn't speak. He didn't ask questions. He just rode fast, slicing through traffic with practiced ease. I had no idea if he believed me, or if he was simply getting me out of sight. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the motorbike skidded to a stop in front of a police station. I jumped off before the bike had even fully stopped, nearly collapsing onto the pavement. The driver barely spared me a glance. "Be careful," he muttered, before pulling away, disappearing into the night. I stumbled toward the entrance. The fluorescent-lit lobby was eerily quiet. 2 uniformed officers sat behind a desk, flipping through papers, the glow of an old television flickering in the background. A fan buzzed lazily in the corner, doing little to battle the humidity inside. I slammed my hands onto the counter, gasping for air. "I need help." The officers looked up. One was older, his face lined with wrinkles, his expression unreadable. The other was younger, fresh-faced, his uniform still crisp. The older one leaned forward. "Slow down. What happened?" I tried to explain everything all at once. The bar, the taxi, Lila. The drugging, the cold room, the doctor. The rows of unconscious people, the organ jars, the escape. The words tumbled out, frantic, desperate. I expected shock, horror, urgency. Instead, the officers exchanged a glance. The older one sighed, rubbing his temples. The younger one shifted in his seat, his lips pressing into a tight line. That was when I felt it. Something off. I hadn't noticed it before, too consumed by fear. But now, in the dead silence between my words, I saw it. The way the older officer's gaze flickered, just briefly, to his partner. A silent exchange. A slight shake of the head. It hit me like ice water down my spine. I took a step back. "You don't believe me." The older officer exhaled slowly, then offered a small, measured nod. "We'll investigate." His tone was even. Too even. I swallowed. "That's it." He gestured toward the door. "Go back to your hotel. Get some rest." A chill crept into my veins. They weren't going to help me. Worse, they knew. A sudden, awful realization settled in my gut. Some of them, maybe not all, but enough, were part of it. I was still in danger. I clenched my fists. My legs screamed to run, but I forced myself to nod. "Okay, thank you." The older officer smiled thinly. "Be careful at night." I turned and walked out, my body trembling. I didn't stop walking until I was back in the chaos of the main streets, neon lights flickering above me, the hum of traffic and tourists filling the air. I didn't go back to my hotel near Khao San Road. I couldn't. Instead, I found a high-end hotel in the business district, the kind with security cameras, doormen, and a lobby full of people. I paid in cash. The receptionist gave me a curious glance at my appearance. Barefoot, clothes damp with sweat, but she didn't ask questions. Within minutes, I was inside a pristine, modern room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the glowing skyline. I locked the door. Then I locked it again. I dragged a chair in front of it for good measure. Only then did I collapse onto the bed, my body aching, my hands still shaking. I was safe. At least, I thought I was. But I knew the truth. I hadn't really escaped. Not yet. Because somewhere out there, Lila was still smiling. And she wasn't done with me. I made it back to the US, but I never really left Thailand. Not in my mind. The first few weeks back home were a blur. Friends welcomed me. My family hugged me tighter than usual, but none of it felt real. I went through the motions, eating, working, pretending, but I wasn't living. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that cold, sterile room. The jars of human organs. The doctor's clinical stare. And Lila's smile. I barely slept. When I did, nightmares waited for me. Dark hallways, hands grabbing at me, surgical instruments glinting in red light. But then, the real nightmares began. One night, I came home late from work, exhausted, barely able to think. As usual, I locked my apartment door, checked it twice, like I always did now. When I woke up the next morning, the door was unlocked. I stood there, staring at the latch, my stomach twisting into knots. Had I forgotten? No, I never forgot now. Someone had been inside. I searched every inch of my apartment, closets, under the bed, even behind the shower curtain. Nothing was missing. Nothing was out of place, except for the fact that someone had been here. A week later, a package arrived. No return address. I opened it with shaking hands. Inside was a single surgical scalpel, its blade gleaming under the kitchen light. And beneath it, a small folded note. I didn't want to read it, but I had to. You got away once. Not again. The room spun around me. My breath came fast, my hands numb. I dropped the package and ran to the window, heart pounding. The street below was normal. People walking, cars honking. But somewhere out there, they were watching. Waiting. I stopped sleeping after that. I stayed awake as long as I could, lights on, a knife under my pillow. But eventually, exhaustion always won. And that was when they came. It was around 3 a.m. when I woke to a sound. A soft creak. My bedroom door. I froze, my body paralyzed with fear. A shadow stood in the doorway. Then, a familiar, honey-smooth voice. "Hello, Nathan." "Lila." She was smiling. And then, darkness. The news barely made international headlines. Another tourist gone missing in Thailand. His name was Michael Carter, 29 years old, from Canada. Last seen at a bar near Khao San Road. Witnesses reported he was seen leaving with a group of locals. One of them, a striking Thai woman with long dark hair. The details were disturbingly familiar. His friends back home launched online campaigns, pleading for any information. The Thai police issued a routine statement, promising an investigation, urging the public to come forward. But those who had lived in Bangkok long enough knew the truth. Michael Carter wasn't coming back, just like so many others. And Nathan Reed? No one ever heard from him again. His apartment remained untouched, rent overdue. His phone went straight to voicemail. His friends, confused but not yet alarmed, assumed he had gone off-grid for a while. But one night, a new package arrived at his old address. No return label. Inside, a single folded piece of paper. A handwritten note, in delicate, precise cursive. "We always get what we want." I have always preferred to hike alone. Some people might find that strange, even reckless, but for me, the solitude of nature is something sacred. Out here, away from the constant hum of the world, I feel at peace. There's no need for conversation, no distractions, just me, the trail, and the wilderness stretching endlessly in every direction. This time, I had chosen a remote section of Yosemite National Park, a place where few tourists ventured. It wasn't an official trail, but that's what I liked about it. I had read about it in an old hiking forum, an unmarked path that led deep into the forest, promising breathtaking views and absolute seclusion. The morning air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. Sunlight filtered through the towering trees, casting long, dappled shadows across the trail. Birds called out to one another, their songs echoing through the silence. My boots crunched softly against the gravel as I walked, each step taking me further away from civilization. I adjusted the straps of my pack and took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the cool mountain air. This was exactly what I needed. A few days to myself, away from the noise and stress of everyday life. As I made my way past the ranger station, something caught my eye, a bulletin board covered with notices, maps, and safety warnings. I slowed my pace, scanning over the usual reminders about fire hazards and wildlife encounters. And then I saw it, a missing person poster. It was a young man, about my age, with short dark hair and an easy smile. The details were sparse. Last seen a few months ago, had been hiking alone, never returned. My stomach tightened slightly. I had seen missing hiker notices before, of course. The wilderness was unforgiving to those who weren't prepared. But something about this one stuck with me. Maybe it was the date, only a few months ago. Maybe it was the location. His last known whereabouts were near the very path I was about to take. I shook off the unease and turned away. "Stay on marked trails," a voice behind me said. I glanced over my shoulder. A ranger, a middle-aged man with weathered skin and sharp eyes, was watching me. "I always do," I replied casually. He studied me for a moment, then nodded. "Good. Some parts of the forest, they're not as friendly as they look." I forced a smile. "I'll be careful." With that, I tightened my pack and set off into the trees, letting the familiar rhythm of hiking push aside my lingering doubts. As the ranger station disappeared from view, a strange feeling settled in my chest. Not fear, exactly, but something close to it. I told myself it was nothing. I had hiked alone countless times before. I would be fine. The trail had been peaceful for the past few hours, just the sound of my own footsteps and the occasional rustling of wildlife in the undergrowth. I was making good progress, my mind lost in the rhythm of hiking, when I spotted a group of 4 standing at a fork in the trail. They were gathered around a map, speaking in hushed tones. As I approached, they looked up, and one of them, a man with a thick beard and a relaxed confidence, grinned at me. "Hey there, friend," he said, stepping forward. "You seem like you know your way around. Maybe you can help us out." I hesitated briefly before stopping a few feet away. "I'll try," I said, adjusting my pack. Up close, I could get a better read on them. The bearded man, Mike, as he soon introduced himself, had an easygoing, almost charismatic air about him. He carried himself with the assurance of someone used to leading. Beside him, Sarah, a woman with bright eyes and an eager expression, smiled warmly. She was friendly but had the kind of energy that felt just a little too curious, like she was studying me as much as the map. A few steps behind them stood a quiet couple, Mark and Lisa. They were harder to read. Mark had the lean build of someone who hiked often, but he barely spoke, just watching with a neutral expression. Lisa was similarly quiet, offering only a polite nod in greeting. Sarah held up the map. "We're trying to find a way to this place," she said, tapping a spot in the forested area. "A viewpoint, not on the official map, but apparently it's incredible." I frowned. "Where'd you hear about it?" Mike chuckled. "You know how it is, friend of a friend." Said it's one of the best views in the park, but not many people know how to get there. I glanced at the map again. I recognized the general area. It was well beyond the marked trails, deep into the wilderness. Not exactly the kind of place you wandered into without knowing what you were doing. "Doesn't look like there's a clear path," I said. "That's part of the adventure," Mike said with a grin. "We just need to find the right way in. You up for it?" I hesitated. Something in my gut told me to say no. There was nothing particularly off about them. They looked like regular hikers, prepared, friendly, just a little too eager to push off the trail. And yet, Sarah must have noticed my hesitation because she gave a playful smirk. "Come on, don't tell me you're afraid of a little off-trail hiking," she teased. "Only the bravest hikers go there." I forced a chuckle. "It's not that." Mike spread his hands. "Look, if you're not interested, no worries. But it could be fun. Company's not a bad thing in the deep woods." That part was true. Hiking alone had its risks. And despite my gut telling me to move on, there was something strangely compelling about them. I nodded slowly. "All right," I said. "I'll come with you." Mike clapped me on the back. "Good man. Let's go find something special." As we stepped off the main trail and into the trees, I told myself this was just another adventure. I ignored the voice in the back of my mind telling me I had just made a mistake. At first, the hike was enjoyable, even refreshing. Mike led the way with effortless confidence, cutting through the dense forest like he had done this 100 times before. The rest of us followed, falling into an easy rhythm as we maneuvered through thick brush and uneven ground. The conversation was lively. Mike cracked jokes about survival skills, Sarah shared amusing travel stories, and even the usually reserved Mark and Lisa chimed in now and then. We passed around water bottles, exchanged hiking tips, and for a while, I let myself relax. Maybe I had been too quick to judge. Maybe they were just a group of adventurous hikers looking for an experience like mine. But then the first sign of trouble appeared. I had pulled out my compass out of habit, just to keep track of our direction. But as I watched the needle, I noticed it was spinning erratically before settling in the wrong direction. I tapped it, shook it. Still wrong. I frowned. That's weird. Sarah, who had been walking beside me, glanced down. What is? My compass. It's not reading correctly. She let out a small laugh. Maybe the magnetic field here is messing with it. I nodded, but something about her response felt off. It was too quick, too dismissive, as if she already expected it. A little while later, I noticed something else. Mark and Sarah had fallen slightly behind, whispering to each other in hushed tones. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but twice, I caught Sarah glancing at me before looking away just as quickly. Lisa, on the other hand, had grown quiet, more so than before. Her eyes darted around the thickening forest, and she chewed her bottom lip, looking like she wanted to say something but thought better of it. I didn't like any of it. Still, I reasoned with myself. Maybe I was overthinking. The forest had a way of playing tricks on people, and I was still shaken from the missing person poster earlier. And yet, as we continued deeper, the uneasy feeling in my gut only grew. The path became more difficult, steeper and rockier than I had expected. The trees thickened, their tangled branches forming a dense canopy overhead. Sunlight barely filtered through now, casting long, spindly shadows over the ground. At one point, I glanced back. The way we had come from was already lost to the thick vegetation. I had no idea how to retrace our steps. Then I checked my phone. No signal, not even a single bar. I swallowed, forcing my voice to stay light. How much further? Mike, still leading, barely glanced back. Just a little more, he said. Trust me, it's worth it. Something in his tone made me uneasy. But turning back wasn't an option anymore. The forest had swallowed the trail behind us, and I had no idea how to navigate out on my own. Then, I noticed another change. The sounds of the forest, birds chirping, the rustling of leaves, the distant hum of insects, had vanished. The silence was absolute. It was unnatural, the kind of quiet that made my skin crawl. Even our footsteps seemed muffled, as if the earth itself was absorbing the sound. I looked up. The trees had changed. Their trunks twisted unnaturally, their branches stretching toward one another like gnarled fingers, weaving together into something that blocked out more than just sunlight. It felt like the forest was closing in on us. Lisa suddenly spoke, her voice tight. Are you sure this is the right way? Mike didn't even turn around. Positive. I wanted to believe him. But the deeper we went, the heavier the air felt. Thick, suffocating, charged with something I couldn't name. I told myself it was just my imagination. I told myself I wasn't trapped. I was wrong. The trees parted suddenly, opening into a small clearing. For a brief moment, relief washed over me. I had expected a hidden viewpoint, some breathtaking vista that justified the difficult trek. But as I took in my surroundings, that relief turned to confusion. There was no view, no sweeping landscapes, no mountains stretching endlessly into the horizon. Just a sheer cliffside, a jagged drop-off disappearing into the abyss below. The ground at the edge crumbled slightly, a loose scatter of rocks tumbling into the void. I took a cautious step forward and peered down. Nothing but darkness. Something wasn't right. I turned to the others. Their expressions had changed. Gone were the easy smiles, the friendly energy. They stood still, silent, their faces unreadable. The atmosphere around them had shifted, thickened with something suffocating. Mike took a slow step toward me. Not friendly, not casual, purposeful. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. This was never about a hike. My heart pounded as I instinctively took a step back, only to remember the cliff behind me. The group had positioned themselves between me and the only way out. Mike exhaled, shaking his head slightly as if disappointed. You really should have stuck to the main trail. His voice was different now. No warmth, no charm, just cold detachment. A flick of his wrist, and suddenly, a knife was in his hand. The steel glinted under the pale light, filtering through the trees. I swallowed hard. Sarah let out a small, almost amused laugh. You're a little too trusting, aren't you? The words sent a shiver down my spine. I took a shaky breath, forcing my voice to stay steady. What do you want? Mike tilted his head, considering me like I was some curious specimen under a microscope. "It's not about what we want," he said. "It's about what needs to happen." Lisa shifted slightly, arms wrapped around herself. She wasn't looking at me. I turned to her, desperate. "Lisa, what is this?" Her face crumpled slightly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry." My stomach turned. "Why?" I choked out. "Why are you doing this?" Mike let out a small sigh, as if he were growing tired of my questions. "Look, hikers go missing out here all the time. It's not uncommon. Accidents happen." Sarah smirked. "And you? You're just another statistic waiting to happen." My pulse thundered in my ears. This wasn't about robbing me. They weren't planning to let me go. The pieces clicked into place, each realization more horrifying than the last. I wasn't their first. I wouldn't be their last. They had done this before. Lisa's hands trembled at her sides, but she didn't move. Mark, still silent, stood firm beside her. His face remained neutral, as if this were just another day, another task to complete. Mike took another step forward, closing the distance. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," he said. "We can do this quick, or—" I didn't let him finish. Pure instinct took over. I turned and ran, straight for the trees, straight for survival. My breath came in ragged gasps. My heart slammed against my ribs. There was no way out. No one knew where I was. If I died here, I would just become another missing person, another face on a faded poster at the ranger station. Mike took another slow step forward, the knife gleaming in his hand. Sarah shifted her weight, ready to pounce. Mark remained motionless, watching like a statue carved from stone. Lisa wouldn't even look at me. I had seconds to act. My mind raced. I had no weapon, no plan, just a cliff at my back and killers in front of me. Then, without thinking, I fainted right. Sarah took the bait, shifting her stance to block me. At the last second, I pivoted and charged left, slamming into her. She yelped as she went down hard, hitting the dirt with a sharp gasp. Mike lunged. The blade flashed toward me. Too fast. I threw myself to the side. The knife missed by inches, slicing through empty air. But the momentum carried Mike forward. Too far forward. His foot landed on loose gravel at the cliff's edge. His face shifted, confusion, then pure terror. His arms flailed, trying to catch his balance. But there was nothing to grab. He teetered for a split second, then his body tilted backward. His scream echoed as he plunged into the abyss. The sound seemed to stretch forever, until it was cut off by a distant, sickening crack. Silence. A long, terrible silence. I froze, panting, unable to process what had just happened. Mike was gone. I had just watched him die. The remaining three stood motionless, staring at the spot where he had vanished. Sarah's breath came in sharp, ragged bursts. Her hands curled into fists at her sides. Then she snapped. A guttural scream ripped from her throat, raw and feral. She spun toward me, eyes blazing with rage. "You!" She lunged. I barely had time to react. I grabbed the first thing I could, a thick branch, fallen near my feet. As she closed the distance, I swung. The wood cracked against her face with a sickening thud. She crumpled, blood spraying from her nose. I didn't wait to see if she'd get back up. I ran, blindly, desperately, plunging into the trees. Branches clawed at my skin, whipping across my face and arms. I didn't care. Behind me, I heard them crashing through the undergrowth. Sarah, shrieking with fury. Mark, his footsteps heavy and relentless. Lisa, still silent. The forest became a twisted labyrinth around me. Everywhere I turned, the trees loomed, their tangled roots jutting from the earth like hands reaching to drag me down. I tripped, caught myself, kept running. Somewhere in the chaos, a terrible thought surfaced. I wasn't just running. I was being herded, driven deeper, trapped, and I was running out of places to go. My lungs burned. My legs screamed, but I couldn't stop. Branches snapped behind me, my pursuers closing in. Sarah's ragged breathing, Mark's heavy footfalls, they were too close. Then, the trees parted, and suddenly, I was at the edge of a river. A wide, rushing current, its dark waters surging past jagged rocks. I skidded to a stop, my chest heaving. Trapped. Behind me, Sarah's voice cut through the night. Nowhere left to run. Hiker. My heart pounded against my ribs. The water was moving fast, too fast. If I jumped, I might not survive. But staying meant death for sure. I turned. Sarah and Mark emerged from the trees, their faces pale in the moonlight. Sarah's nose was still bleeding, her eyes wild with fury. She took a step forward, then stopped. For the first time, I saw hesitation in her expression. Not because she was afraid of me, because she knew what I was about to do. I took one last, shuddering breath, and leapt. The cold was a living thing. The moment I hit the water, it wrenched the air from my lungs, squeezing my chest like a vice. The current grabbed me with icy fingers, yanking me under. Darkness swallowed me. I flailed, twisting, tumbling, my limbs useless against the raging current. Up. I needed to get up. I kicked, reaching, praying. Then, my head broke the surface. I gasped, barely sucking in air before another wave crashed over me, dragging me downstream. I surrendered to it. Let it take me. Sarah's scream was lost in the roar of the river. The world blurred into chaos. Water, rock, sky, darkness. Somewhere in the madness, my body slammed against something solid. Pain exploded through my ribs. I clung to the shape, half-submerged driftwood, wrapping my arms around it like a lifeline. The river carried me. I don't know how long. Minutes? Hours. All I knew was the cold. Then, the current slowed. The water became shallower. I felt ground beneath me. With the last of my strength, I clawed my way to the shore, dragging myself onto the wet, muddy bank. I collapsed onto my back, gasping. I was alive. Alone, but alive. Somewhere in the distance, past the dense wall of trees, I saw them. Lights. Faint and flickering, but real. A ranger station. Safety. Every muscle in my body screamed as I pushed myself to my feet. I staggered forward. One step, then another. Every step agony. But I kept going. Because I wasn't going to die out here. Not tonight. Not like them. I don't remember much of the final stretch. Only that each step felt heavier than the last. My body screamed in protest, my skin numb from the freezing river, my legs shaking beneath me. But I kept going. The lights grew brighter. Then voices. And then, warm hands grabbing my arms, holding me up as my knees finally buckled. I collapsed at the ranger station, barely able to speak. Everything came out in broken, gasping fragments. The hike, the group, the cliff, the knife, the chase, the river. They listened. They called for help. And when the police arrived, I told them everything. They sent search teams into the forest. Hours later, they found Mike's body at the bottom of the cliff, broken and lifeless. But of Sarah, Mark, or Lisa, no trace. No footprints leading away from the clearing. No discarded gear. Nothing. The officers were quiet as they took my statement, their faces grim. One of them, an older man with tired eyes, placed a firm hand on my shoulder. "If they're still out there," he said, "they won't stop." The words settled into my bones like ice. I left Yosemite the next day. I returned home, but I never truly escaped. The nightmares started almost immediately. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my pulse hammering in my ears. Always the same dream, running through the dark woods, branches clawing at my face, shadows moving in the corners of my vision. And always, always, Sarah's voice, whispering from the darkness. "You should have stayed on the main trail." I told myself it was just my imagination, that they were long gone, that they weren't watching me. But sometimes, in a crowded street, I'd catch a glimpse of someone with long dark hair and a familiar smirk, or a man standing too still, staring just a little too long, or a whisper, barely audible over the wind. "You should have stayed on the main trail." And in those moments, I wonder, did I really escape? Or are they still out there, waiting, hunting, for someone else to trust them, for someone else to take the wrong path, for someone else to disappear? There was nothing quite like the solitude of the wilderness. The hum of the city, the relentless buzz of notifications, and the weight of deadlines. It all faded away the moment I set foot in the forest. I had always found peace in places where most people felt uncomfortable. Out here, in the vast, untouched stretches of northern Michigan, I could breathe. No traffic, no voices, just the crisp autumn air, the scent of damp earth, and the quiet murmur of trees swaying in the wind. I had planned this solo camping trip for weeks. 3 days in the wild, alone with my thoughts, a small tent, and just the essentials. I had done this before, more times than I could count. Some people found the idea of being completely alone in the forest unsettling, but I thrived in it. I knew how to handle myself. Still, as I drove along the narrow dirt road that cut through miles of dense woodland, I couldn't shake a small, nagging unease. It wasn't fear, exactly, just an odd sensation, like a distant whisper at the back of my mind. Maybe it was the season. Late October had a way of making the world feel emptier, quieter. Before heading into the forest, I stopped at a small gas station at the edge of town to top off my tank. The place looked like it hadn't changed in 50 years. Dusty shelves, faded signs, and a single, flickering fluorescent light over the register. An old man stood behind the counter, eyeing me with curiosity as I grabbed a bottle of water and some beef jerky. "Camping out there alone?" he asked as I paid. "Yep, just a weekend trip," I said, trying to sound casual. He nodded slowly but didn't smile. "Be careful out there." I chuckled. "Yeah, I always am." He hesitated, then leaned in slightly. His voice lowered. "Some folks, they don't come back." Something about the way he said it, flat, matter of fact, sent a brief chill down my spine. It wasn't a warning, not exactly. More like a statement of fact. I forced a laugh. I'll keep that in mind. The bell above the door jingled as I stepped out, and I tried to shake off the unease. Old-timers like to spook outsiders. It was just a thing they did. Still, the words lingered as I got back into my car. The road became rougher the deeper I went. Towering pines lined both sides, their trunks dark and looming. The sky had turned a dull gray, and a thin mist clung to the forest floor, weaving through the underbrush like ghostly fingers. I was about 20 minutes from my chosen campsite when something caught my eye, a weathered, rusted metal sign, half buried in the tall grass by the side of the road. I slowed down and squinted at the faded letters. "Area under investigation. Do not enter." The words were barely legible, scratched, and worn away by time. There were no fences, no fresh markers, just that old sign, nearly forgotten by the forest itself. I frowned. Probably some abandoned government project. Maybe an old mining site or a stretch of land affected by contamination. Whatever it was, it looked like no one had paid attention to it in years. I shrugged it off and kept driving. A few minutes later, I reached the clearing where I planned to set up camp. It was perfect, secluded, flat, and surrounded by thick trees. I killed the engine, stepping out into the crisp autumn air. The silence was immediate and absolute. I took a deep breath, letting the stillness settle over me. Alone, just how I liked it. But as I unpacked my gear, the old man's words whispered back in my mind. "Some folks, they don't come back." I set up my campsite in a small clearing near the lake, just as the sun began its slow descent. The golden light filtered through the trees, casting long, shifting shadows across the forest floor. It was peaceful, the kind of place where you could lose track of time and forget the outside world existed. The air smelled of damp earth and pine, and the water's surface reflected the darkening sky. I took my time pitching my tent, setting up a small fire pit, and unpacking my gear. This was the part one loved most, being out here, completely self-reliant, away from the constant pull of screens and responsibilities. But as I walked the perimeter of my site, something caught my eye. Footprints. Large, deep imprints in the soft dirt, leading away from the lake toward the tree line. They weren't mine, too big, too wide. My boots didn't match the pattern. I knelt down, running my fingers along the edges. They weren't fresh, but they weren't old either. A few days, maybe. Other campers. Had to be. Still, the size of them made me pause. Whoever left these prints was big, easily over 6 feet tall, judging by the depth of the impressions. I shook off the thought. It wasn't unusual. Hunters, hikers, or some other solo camper like me. No reason to dwell on it. As the light faded, I grabbed my flashlight and went to gather firewood. The forest was dense, but not difficult to navigate. Dry branches snapped under my boots as I searched for kindling, my breath misting in the chilly evening air. Then, about 20 feet from my campsite, something stopped me in my tracks. A single black glove hung from a low tree branch. It was damp, the leather dark and worn, fingers curled slightly inward as if still gripping something. I stared at it for a moment, my mind flickering between possibilities. Someone must have dropped it. Maybe another camper left it behind. Or maybe it was nothing, just an old, forgotten thing caught in the branches by the wind. Still, something about it felt wrong. I exhaled sharply, reaching up to grab it. The leather was cold and slick under my fingers. Someone must have dropped it, I muttered to myself, tossing it aside into the underbrush. The moment it hit the ground, an eerie stillness settled over the woods. The wind, the rustling leaves, the distant hum of crickets, all of it stopped. Just silence. A thick, unnatural silence that pressed in on my ears, making me suddenly aware of my own heartbeat. I swallowed hard, forcing a chuckle. Relax, man. You're psyching yourself out. The second I turned back toward camp, the sounds resumed as if nothing had happened. A cricket chirped. The wind rustled the trees. The normal, comforting noises of the wild. I hurried back, trying not to look over my shoulder. By the time I got the fire going, the sky was fully dark. The flames crackled, casting flickering shadows against the trees. I made dinner, sipped from my water bottle, and tried to enjoy the solitude. But that feeling, like something was just slightly off, never left me. I told myself it was the footprints, the glove, my mind turning harmless details into something eerie. I crawled into my tent around midnight, zipping myself into my sleeping bag and listening to the soft whisper of the wind through the trees. The fire outside had burned down to glowing embers. Everything was calm. I was drifting on the edge of sleep when I heard it. Step, step, pause, step, step, pause, footsteps. My eyes snapped open, heart hammering against my ribs. The sound was faint but deliberate, circling my tent. Step, step, pause. Not an animal. Too slow. Too calculated. I stayed completely still, barely breathing. My hand slid toward my pocket knife, fingers closing around the handle. The footsteps stopped. Silence. I strained my ears, listening so hard it hurt. Nothing. Minutes passed, stretching impossibly long. Finally, I exhaled, forcing myself to relax. Probably just the wind. Maybe a raccoon or something small shifting through the underbrush. I told myself that, repeated it in my head like a mantra, and yet, I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I didn't realize I had fallen asleep until the soft glow of dawn crept through the tent fabric. My body was stiff, my mind clouded from the restless night. I lay there for a few moments, trying to shake the lingering unease that clung to me like a damp fog. Then I noticed something strange. My backpack, which I had zipped up before bed, was partially open. I sat up slowly, rubbing my eyes, trying to recall if I had left it that way. No, I was sure I hadn't. I reached for it, inspecting the contents. My food, flashlight, first aid kit, everything was still there. Nothing was missing, but things were off. The zipper had been pulled down in a way I wouldn't have done. Some of my supplies were shifted around, as if someone had carefully searched through them. Not in a messy, hurried way, but with precision. A shiver ran down my spine. Maybe an animal had gotten into it, but there were no bite marks, no signs of chewing. And what kind of animal unzips a backpack, looks through it, and then leaves everything untouched? I swallowed hard and turned my gaze to the rest of my campsite. That's when I noticed the next thing. My gear had been rearranged. Not dramatically, just subtle little changes. My boots, which I had left next to the tent flap, were now slightly farther apart. My cooking pot had been moved a few inches to the left. My sleeping bag inside the tent was folded differently at the edges, like someone had smoothed it out. A crawling sensation spread through my chest. I forced myself to breathe, to think rationally. Maybe I had done this last night and forgotten. Maybe the wind had knocked things around. Maybe. My eyes locked onto something hanging from my tent zipper. The black glove. I froze. My pulse slammed in my ears as I stared at it. I had thrown it away. I had thrown it away. And yet, here it was, dangling from the tent. Its damp fingers curled inward like they had been the night before. My breath hitched. For the first time, real fear sank its teeth into me. This wasn't my mind playing tricks on me. This wasn't the wind. Someone had been here. Someone had searched my belongings, moved my things, and then deliberately placed that glove where I would see it. I grabbed it with shaking hands, flung it into the trees, and stood up abruptly. My skin crawled, my instincts screaming at me to leave. I wasn't safe here. I had spent enough time in the wilderness to trust my gut. When you feel watched, when your body senses something isn't right, you listen. Without wasting time, I packed my gear, keeping my knife within reach. I needed to move. I hiked for hours, deeper into the forest, further than I had originally planned. I wanted to put as much distance as possible between me and that first campsite. The new location was even more remote, tucked between thick pines with a small rocky ridge on one side. There were no signs of past campers, no trails, nothing but untouched wilderness. Good. I set up my tent again, forcing myself to go through the motions as if everything were normal. The fire crackled, the wind rustled through the trees, but the feeling hadn't left me. That creeping sensation, like I was being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, scanning the tree-line, but there was nothing there. No movement, no sounds beyond the usual forest ambience. Still, the back of my neck prickled, my nerves on edge. Someone had been at my previous site. Had they followed me here? I didn't know. But as the sun dipped lower, the familiar unease settled in once again. And this time, it felt even closer. That night, I zipped myself inside my tent, sealing off the outside world as best I could. My knife rested in my lap, my flashlight within arm's reach. I wasn't playing games anymore. The moment the last sliver of sunlight vanished behind the treetops, the forest felt different. The usual nighttime sounds, the chirping of insects, the occasional rustling in the underbrush, felt distant, as if muffled by some unseen force. I told myself to stay calm, to breathe. Nothing had happened since I moved campsites. Whatever was out there, whoever was out there, was probably long gone. But as midnight approached, the sounds returned. At first, it was subtle, a faint shift in the leaves, a whisper of movement just beyond the trees. Then, the footsteps began. Heavy, deliberate. Step, step, step. I stopped breathing. This wasn't an animal. Animals moved erratically, quick, darting steps, scratching, sniffing. This was different. This was someone. The steps circled the tent, slow and measured, as if whoever, or whatever it was, wanted me to hear them. Step, step, pause. I gripped the knife tighter, my pulse hammering in my throat. The steps stopped. Silence. Then, a soft, deliberate pressure against the tent fabric. Not a full push, not an aggressive shove, just fingertips brushing against the nylon, dragging along the edges in a slow, calculated motion. My mouth went dry. I wanted to move, to scream, to do something, but my body was locked in place. The sensation continued, tracing along the side of the tent, pausing, then moving again. Slow, methodical. It knew I was inside. I forced myself to act. In one frantic motion, I lunged for my flashlight, unzipped the tent in a frenzy, and thrust the light outside. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees, the empty clearing, the fire pit. Nothing. No movement. No sound. I swallowed hard, my breath ragged, my heart threatening to explode from my chest. Had I imagined it? I stood frozen, the flashlight beam shaking slightly in my grip. Then, just beyond the reach of the light, something shifted. My breath hitched. At the far edge of the clearing, barely visible between the trees, a figure stood. Tall, motionless, watching. I couldn't make out its face, its features, only the vague outline of a body, standing completely still, just there. A sick, primal terror surged through me. I blinked, and it was gone. The trees stood empty. The darkness swallowed whatever had been there. I wanted to convince myself it was a trick of the light, my sleep-deprived mind playing tricks on me. But deep down I knew. I wasn't alone out here. Something was watching, and it wanted me to know. Morning came, but the fear didn't leave with the darkness. I hadn't slept. Not really. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure standing at the edge of the clearing, unmoving, watching. The memory felt like a stain in my mind, something permanent that wouldn't wash away no matter how many times I told myself it wasn't real. But it was real. I could still feel the terror in my chest, the lingering weight of something unseen pressing against my senses. I needed to get out of here. I tore through my campsite, packing in frantic, clumsy motions. The tent poles rattled as I yanked them free, stuffing everything into my backpack without care. My fingers fumbled with the straps, my breath coming in short, shallow bursts. I had planned for a peaceful weekend. Now, all I wanted was to leave. I swung my pack over my shoulder and turned toward the direction of my truck. But then, I saw them. The footprints. Not just mine. There were others. My boot prints from the night before were still there, a clear path leading from my tent to the tree line. But alongside them, overlapping in places, were deeper imprints. Large, wide, heavy, and they weren't just passing through. The tracks moved in circles around my tent, over and over, pacing, stopping, then continuing again. My stomach clenched. Whoever, whatever, had been out here last night, it hadn't left. It had stood there for hours, watching, waiting. I stumbled back, my breath turning ragged. A cold sweat prickled at my skin. No more thinking, no more questioning. I had to move. Now, I hoisted my backpack, turned toward the forest, and ran. I didn't care about the trail anymore. I crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping against my arms, dried leaves crunching loudly beneath my boots. The dense trees blurred around me, the weight of my pack slowing me down, but I didn't stop. My only focus was getting back to the truck. I didn't look behind me. I wouldn't look behind me. I don't know how long I ran. Maybe minutes. Maybe an eternity. The world had narrowed down to nothing but my pounding heart, the sting of cold air in my lungs, and the rhythmic slam of my boots against the forest floor. Then, through the trees, I saw it. The parking area. Relief surged through me, my body nearly collapsing from exhaustion and adrenaline. I could see my truck, the familiar dark shape sitting at the edge of the lot, right where I left it. But something was wrong. The driver's side door hung open. My supplies, my extra gear, my food, were scattered across the ground. My stomach lurched as I stumbled closer, my pulse hammering in my ears. Then I saw the hood, bent upward, torn open. I stepped forward, breath coming in ragged gasps, and peered inside. The engine was destroyed, wires yanked free, tubing slashed open, the battery missing entirely. Not just damaged, ruined. I backed away, legs trembling, my vision blurring at the edges. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't an animal. This was deliberate. I wasn't just being watched. I was being hunted. I had no choice. With my truck ruined, my supplies scattered, and the certainty that I wasn't alone out here, I did the only thing I could. I ran. Back into the woods. Away from the destruction. Away from whatever had been watching me. I knew it was reckless. I knew the worst thing you could do in a survival situation was abandon your location without a plan. But this wasn't a normal situation. This wasn't getting lost or running out of food. Something was out here, and it wanted me to stay. I needed to find a road, a trail, anything. I moved fast, ignoring the burning in my legs, the ache in my shoulders from my half-packed gear. The sun hung low in the sky, dipping behind the trees, bleeding the last light of day into the horizon. I had maybe an hour before darkness swallowed the forest whole. I couldn't be out here when it did. At first, I thought it was my own paranoia. The feeling of being watched. The nagging sense that something lurked just beyond the trees. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Behind me. I froze. The sound stopped. I swallowed, forcing myself to turn my head slightly, scanning the dense woodland behind me. Nothing moved. No shadows shifted. I took another step. Crunch. Then, a second later. Crunch. I stopped again. The sound stopped with me. My breath hitched. I wasn't alone. I wasn't imagining this. I took a shaky step forward, then another. Slowly now. Crunch. Crunch. Something was following me. Not charging. Not attacking. Just stalking. Waiting. Panic threatened to take over. My body screamed at me to run, to get as far away as possible, but I knew better. Running blindly would only make it worse. I needed to hide. I scanned the area, my mind racing. Then I saw it. A massive tree, its branches thick, its trunk sturdy. It was my best option. I hurried to it, gripping the rough bark with trembling hands. Climbing with my pack on was nearly impossible, so I yanked it off, slinging it over one shoulder as I hoisted myself upward. My muscles screamed in protest, but I pushed through. Higher, higher. I climbed until I was at least 15 feet off the ground, wedging myself between two thick branches, pressing my back against the trunk. My hands were slick with sweat. My breathing came in sharp gasps. Then I waited. Silence. The forest stretched around me, dark and unmoving. The wind rustled through the leaves, and for a moment, I let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, I had lost it. Then I heard the voice. I see you. My blood turned to ice. The whisper came from below. Slow, garbled, wrong, like multiple voices layered on top of each other, all speaking in unison. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. My gaze dropped, and I saw it. Standing directly beneath my tree. The figure, not fully human, not fully anything. A vague shape in the darkness, its form shifting like a shadow struggling to stay solid. No distinct features, no eyes, just an outline of something tall, staring straight up at me. The whispering continued. A low, twisted murmur. Words I couldn't understand. Voices that didn't belong to a single throat. I gripped the branch so tightly my knuckles turned white. My lungs burned from holding my breath. It didn't move. Neither did I. A battle of silence. A game I refused to lose. The minutes stretched into something unbearable, my muscles cramping, my mind teetering on the edge of panic. Then, the figure turned. Slow, deliberate. It walked away, fading into the trees, swallowed by the dark. I stayed in that tree until daylight. I didn't dare come down. At first light, I climbed down from the tree, my body stiff and trembling with exhaustion. My limbs ached from holding still for so long, but I didn't care. I needed to get out. The forest no longer felt like a place of peace. It was a living thing now, watching, waiting, filled with something I didn't understand. I forced myself forward, stumbling through the undergrowth. My legs were weak, my mind foggy, but I moved on instinct. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to keep moving. Then, through the trees, I saw it. A ranger station. Small, worn down, but real. A last lifeline. I half ran, half crawled to the door, finding it locked. I didn't hesitate. I slammed my shoulder into the wood, once, twice, until it gave way with a splintering crack. Inside, dust coated the air. Empty chairs, a desk covered in old maps. A radio. My hands shook as I reached for it. Hello? Hello? My name is Ethan Cole. I'm lost. My truck is destroyed. I need help. Please. Static. For a terrifying moment, I thought the radio was dead. Then, a crackle. A voice. This is Ranger Post 7. We hear you. Stay put. We're sending a team. I collapsed against the desk, breath shuddering out of me. Relief flooded through my body, but it didn't erase the fear. I wasn't safe yet. I wouldn't be safe until I was out of these woods. The Rangers arrived an hour later. I had never been so grateful to see another person in my life. They found me pale, shaking, barely able to explain what had happened. I told them about the footprints, the whispering, the figure in the trees. They exchanged uneasy glances. When they took me back to my truck, their faces turned grim. The doors still hung open. My supplies were still scattered. The engine still lay in ruins. And there, sitting on the hood, a single black glove. No tracks. No signs of another person. Just the glove. One of the Rangers picked it up, turning it over in his hands. Storm must have knocked it out of a tree, he said, though his voice wavered slightly. I didn't argue. I just wanted to leave. Weeks passed. I tried to move on, tried to forget, but the fear never truly left. Some nights, when the house was dark and silent, I swore I heard it. Step, step, pause, faint, distant, growing closer. I told myself it was my mind playing tricks on me, that it was just paranoia. But then, little things started happening. Items in my apartment weren't where I left them. Cabinets left slightly open. A chair pulled just a little too far from the table. I tried to ignore it, until the night I woke up and saw it, sitting on my bedroom windowsill, waiting, a single black glove. The open road had always felt like home to me. There was something about the hum of tires against asphalt, the endless sky stretching above, and the freedom of going wherever the wind took me. No schedules, no deadlines, just the raw, untamed beauty of the land. This trip was supposed to be my masterpiece, a solo journey across the Southwest, filming a documentary on desert landscapes and the ghost towns scattered across the vast emptiness. California to Texas, with nothing but my car, my camera, and the promise of uncharted places waiting to be explored. The sun had already dipped below the horizon when I pulled into the gas station. The place barely looked operational, just a flickering neon open sign and a single, rusted-out gas pump. It was the kind of place you'd drive past without a second thought, but my tank was running low, and the next station was miles away. As I stepped out, the dry desert air wrapped around me, thick with the scent of dust and gasoline. The gas station's lights buzzed faintly, casting long shadows over the cracked pavement. Inside, the store was just as desolate as the road outside. The shelves were nearly bare, save for a few cans of soup and some faded bags of chips. Behind the counter sat an old man, his weathered face half hidden beneath the brim of a battered cap. His milky eyes followed me as I grabbed a bottle of water and approached the register. "You're out late," he said, his voice as dry as the air. "Yeah, just passing through," I replied, setting my items down. The old man gave a slow nod, then glanced toward the door. His fingers tapped absently against the counter, yellowed nails clicking on the wood. "Where you headed?" "Texas. Filming a documentary." His expression didn't change, but there was something in his eyes, something that made my skin prickle. "You be careful out there," he muttered. "Road like this stretches far enough. You start seeing things that ain't meant to be seen." I chuckled, trying to brush off the unease creeping up my spine. "I'll keep that in mind." The old man didn't laugh. Instead, he nodded toward a faded poster pinned to the bulletin board near the door. The edges were curled, the ink slightly smudged from time. It was a missing person notice. A young man, early 20s, with shaggy brown hair and a weary smile. The date on the bottom was over a year old. "People go missing out here more than you'd think," the cashier said, his voice lower now. "Desert don't always give back what it takes." A gust of wind rattled the door, and for a brief second, I had the irrational urge to get back in my car and leave immediately. But I shook it off, paid for my gas, and stepped outside. As I filled up my tank, the night stretched around me, endless and quiet. The road ahead was empty, nothing but a thin strip of pavement disappearing into the darkness. I climbed into my car, started the engine, and pulled away from the station. In the rearview mirror, I saw the old man still standing at the doorway, watching as I drove off. His words lingered in my mind longer than I cared to admit. "Some folks ain't meant to be found." The desert stretched endlessly on either side of the highway, a vast and lifeless expanse of sand and rock. The moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the cracked pavement. My headlights were the only thing cutting through the darkness, and the road ahead felt like it could go on forever. That's when I saw him. A lone figure stood by the roadside, his thumb out, illuminated in the harsh glare of my high beams. I slowed instinctively. It wasn't unusual to see hitchhikers out in the middle of nowhere, and I'd picked up a few before, travelers, drifters, folks just trying to get from one place to another. But as I rolled closer, something about this man gave me pause. He was tall, rugged, maybe in his 40s. His brown jacket was covered in dust, his jeans stiff with dirt. A thick layer of stubble coated his face, and his hair was matted beneath the shadow of a baseball cap. But what unsettled me most was his expression. He wasn't desperate, wasn't anxious like most hitchhikers. His face was calm, too calm, and when he smiled, it lingered just a little too long. Still, I pulled over. Leaving someone stranded out here, miles from the nearest town, felt cruel. The desert was merciless at night. He leaned down to my open window, his eyes hidden in the dark. "Hey man, thanks for stopping. My car broke down a ways back." Been walking for hours. His voice was low, steady. He didn't sound out of breath, despite claiming he'd been walking for miles. I hesitated, but the silence of the road pressed in around me. "Where you headed?" I asked. He shrugged. "Wherever you're going is fine. Just need a ride to the next town." Something about that answer made my skin crawl. Most people had a destination, a plan. Still, I nodded and unlocked the door. He slid into the passenger seat, closing the door with a soft click. As I pulled back onto the road, I stole a glance at him. Up close, he looked even rougher. His jacket was frayed at the sleeves, his knuckles raw. But what bothered me most was that he had nothing with him. No backpack, no water, no phone, just the clothes on his back. "Name's Jake," he said after a while, his voice breaking the silence. "Appreciate the ride." "Ethan," I replied, gripping the wheel a little tighter. For a few minutes, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the low hum of the tires against the road. But I could feel him watching me. Or, more specifically, watching the glove compartment where I kept my wallet and phone. "Where do you say your car broke down?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. "Back there a ways," he said vaguely, waving a hand behind us. "Was it out of gas?" "Something like that." I nodded slowly. The tension in the car thickened. Then he started asking questions. "You always travel alone?" I forced a chuckle. "Yeah, I like the freedom." Jake nodded, as if that answer pleased him. He turned his gaze back to the road. "What would you do?" he said after a moment. "If someone tried to steal your car out here?" I stiffened. The question was too specific, too deliberate. I kept my eyes forward, pretending not to notice the way he shifted slightly in his seat. "Never thought about it," I lied. Jake let out a soft chuckle. "Not a bad way to go, though. No one around for miles. No one to hear a thing." The words sent a chill up my spine. For the first time, I regretted stopping. "How long do you think a body lasts in the desert?" The question hung in the air, thick and heavy. My fingers tightened around the wheel. I forced a laugh, but it came out thin. "You watch too many crime shows, man." Jake grinned. "Yeah, maybe." The road stretched on, endless and dark. And suddenly, I felt very, very alone. The road stretched ahead, empty and endless, swallowed by darkness. Hours had passed since I picked up Jake, yet the silence between us had only grown heavier. Every so often, I would glance in the rearview mirror, half hoping to see another pair of headlights in the distance. But the desert remained lifeless. Just me, my car, and the stranger beside me. Jake had settled into his seat, his posture too relaxed, as if he belonged there. But he wasn't just sitting quietly. He was fiddling with the radio. At first, it seemed like a harmless distraction, flipping through static-filled stations, pausing now and then on bursts of garbled voices or eerie, distant music. But then he started doing it deliberately, turning the knob slowly, as if he were searching for something specific. A voice crackled through the speakers, distorted and fading. Jake froze, listening. Then he grinned. "Almost sounds like they're talking to us," he murmured, his fingers still on the dial. I swallowed hard and forced a laugh. "Yeah, weird signal out here. Probably bouncing off the mountains." Jake didn't respond. He just hummed, a low, tuneless melody under his breath. His fingers tapped against the dashboard in perfect rhythm. It wasn't a nervous tick. It was intentional. I kept my focus on the road, trying to ignore the sound. The rhythmic tapping, the eerie humming, the way the static on the radio seemed to pulse along with it. Then, without warning, he reached into his jacket. I tensed. A flash of metal caught the dim glow of the dashboard lights. A knife. Not a big one. Just a pocket knife, the kind someone might carry for utility. But the way he handled it made my stomach twist. He flipped the blade open lazily, turning it in his fingers before using it to scrape beneath his nails. Casual, unbothered. Like this was a normal thing to do in someone else's car, in the dead of night, in the middle of nowhere. I kept my face neutral, pretending I hadn't noticed. But my heartbeat thundered in my ears. "So, Ethan," Jake said, his voice light, conversational. "What do you think people fear most?" I forced my hands to stay steady on the wheel. "I don't know. Probably death." Jake chuckled, shaking his head. "No, not death itself. It's the waiting. The knowing it's coming but not knowing when." I didn't respond. My mind was racing. I needed to get him out of my car. I made the decision right then. The next gas station, the next town, whatever came first, I was stopping. I'd make up an excuse, something about checking my tires or needing a break, and I'd leave him there. But then Jake leaned forward, peering at the dark horizon ahead. And before I could react, his hand shot out. He pressed the central lock button. The soft click of the doors sealing shut sent a wave of cold panic through me. "Let's not stop just yet," Jake murmured. The night's still young. The gas station was just up ahead. The glowing sign flickered weakly in the distance, a beacon of safety. But now I wasn't sure if I'd ever make it there. The instant Jake pressed the lock button, I knew I had made a mistake. The gas station was so close, less than half a mile ahead, glowing dimly in the night, but it might as well have been 100 miles away. My pulse hammered in my throat as I forced myself to stay calm. Keep driving, act normal. "Hey, man," I said, keeping my voice even. "I actually need to stop for gas soon." Jake turned his head slowly, his lips curving into that too long smile. "Nah," he said, his voice as smooth as sandpaper. "You got plenty left." The air in the car felt thick, suffocating. My eyes flicked to the gas station's entrance. It was run down, abandoned looking, but it had lights. A chance. I just had to. "Turn here," Jake said. I blinked. "What?" His hand moved fast. Too fast. A cold, metallic click filled the car. I glanced down. The barrel of a gun, dull and black, was aimed straight at my ribs. "Turn," Jake repeated, his voice still eerily calm. My throat went dry. Every instinct screamed at me to floor it, to race toward the gas station, to throw open the door and run. But the gun was steady in his grip, and I had no doubt he'd use it. Slowly, I turned the wheel. The paved highway disappeared behind us as I veered onto a dirt road, the tires crunching against loose gravel. The gas station faded in my rearview mirror. I swallowed against the knot of fear tightening in my chest. "Look, if you want money, Keep driving," Jake interrupted. The headlights carved through the darkness, revealing nothing but barren desert stretching for miles. No signs, no buildings, no hope of another car passing by. I had no idea how long we drove. 5 minutes? 10. Time blurred together in my growing panic. The road became rougher, dust kicking up in thick clouds behind us. The farther we went, the deeper the pit in my stomach grew. Finally, Jake tapped the gun against my side. "Stop here." I hesitated. "Why?" His smile widened. "Because this is where it gets fun." My hands trembled as I brought the car to a stop. Outside, the night swallowed everything. No landmarks, no light pollution, just the eerie quiet of the desert and the vast emptiness stretching in all directions. I gripped the wheel tightly. "Listen, man, I don't know what you." "Step out," Jake ordered. The weight of the gun was gone, but before I could even process it, he was moving. He popped his door open, stepping out into the night, and a second later, he yanked mine open too. The desert air rushed in, cold and dry. Jake stood there, silhouetted against the dim glow of the car's headlights, his gun holstered now. In his hand, he held something else. A hunting knife. A wicked-looking thing with a serrated edge, catching the light as he tilted it, as if admiring it. My stomach twisted. "You get a 5-minute head start," he said, his voice thick with amusement. "Run." My breath hitched. Jake grinned wider. "If I catch you, well." He shrugged, as if the ending of that sentence was already obvious. The horror of it crashed over me like a tidal wave. He wasn't robbing me. He was hunting me. The vast emptiness of the desert stretched around me. Nowhere to hide, nowhere to go. But I had no choice. I turned and ran. I ran. The cold night air burned my lungs, every breath raw and jagged. My feet pounded against the uneven desert floor, slipping over loose gravel and sharp stones. Behind me, the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps echoed in the darkness. And worse, he was whistling. A slow, haunting tune, carried on the wind, playful, almost cheerful. It sent ice through my veins. I didn't look back. The desert stretched endlessly ahead, nothing but shadowed hills and patches of jagged rock. Every instinct screamed at me to find shelter, find cover, But there was nothing, just an open graveyard of cracked earth and scattered cacti. He's taking his time. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Jake wasn't sprinting after me. He didn't have to. He knew the desert better than I did. He knew I was already at a disadvantage, dehydrated, exhausted, unprepared. And worst of all, he was enjoying this. "Come on, Ethan." Jake's voice rang out behind me, taunting, carrying across the vast emptiness. "It's no fun if you don't scream a little." I clenched my jaw, forcing my body forward, legs burning. I had no idea how much of a head start I'd gained, but it wasn't enough. My foot hit a loose patch of dirt, and suddenly I was tumbling forward, my body slamming into the ground. Rocks scraped my palms, tearing the skin raw. I gasped, rolling onto my back, my chest heaving. The whistling stopped. I froze. Somewhere behind me, Jake had paused, listening. He knows I fell. I forced myself up, every muscle screaming in protest. My only hope was to stay ahead, to keep moving before he. A beam of light cut through the night. I ducked instinctively, pressing myself against the ground. The flashlight swung lazily from side to side, searching. "That was a nasty fall," Jake called out, his voice closer now. Too close. My breath was ragged, chest rising and falling in short, panicked bursts. I scanned the area frantically, my eyes landing on a rocky outcrop a few yards away. If I could just get behind it. I pushed forward, crawling low, every movement slow, deliberate. The rocks were jagged, digging into my knees, but I barely noticed. I reached the outcrop, curling behind it, pressing my back against the cool stone. The desert fell silent. The only sound was my heartbeat, thundering in my ears. I forced my breaths to slow. "Don't make a sound. Don't move." Seconds stretched into eternity. Then, click, the unmistakable sound of a gun being cocked. Boom. A gunshot shattered the silence, the bullet whizzing past the rock, close enough that I felt the air shift. I clenched my teeth, resisting the urge to cry out. He was toying with me. He could have hit me if he wanted to, but he wanted me scared, terrified. "Close one," Jake chuckled. "I'll give you that." The flashlight beam swayed again, moving further, giving me an opening. I swallowed my fear. I have to keep running. I tightened my fists, feeling the sting of dirt in my scraped palms. Then I bolted. My legs were giving out. Every breath felt like fire in my lungs. The cold night air cut into my sweat-soaked skin, but I couldn't stop. Not now. Not with Jake still out there, hunting me. Then, through the shadows, I saw it. A camper trailer. It sat alone in the middle of the desert, rusted and forgotten, half buried in sand. A relic of another time, long abandoned. The windows were shattered, and the door barely clung to its hinges, swaying slightly in the night breeze. I didn't hesitate. I lunged toward it, stumbling onto the creaking metal steps, shoving the door open. The stench of decay hit me instantly. Stale air, dust, something deeper, more rotten. Inside, the place was a wreck. Empty cans littered the floor. A broken radio sat on the counter, its wires exposed, useless. Torn fabric hung from the ceiling like cobwebs. And then I saw it. The skull. It sat in the corner, hollow-eyed and grinning, half buried in a pile of discarded clothes and bones. My stomach twisted. I'm not the first. A wave of nausea rolled over me, but I forced myself to focus. Survive now, break later. My eyes darted around the camper, searching desperately for anything that could be used as a weapon. That's when I spotted it. An old hunting rifle, mounted on the wall. I reached for it, my hands shaking. The wood was cracked, the barrel rusted. I doubted it could even fire, but a gun didn't need to shoot to be deadly. The crunch of footsteps outside made my blood run cold. Jake was close. "Time's up." His voice slithered through the walls, sending a fresh wave of panic through me. I gripped the rifle tight, raising it like a bat. My heart pounded as the door creaked open. Jake stepped inside, silhouetted against the dim moonlight. His smile was wider now, his knife glinting in his hand. I didn't wait. I lunged. The butt of the rifle slammed into his shoulder with a sickening crack. He staggered back, cursing, but he didn't drop the knife. I swung again. This time, he caught the barrel mid-swing, twisting it with brutal strength. I felt the wood splinter under my grip as he wrenched it away, tossing it aside. Then his fist collided with my ribs. Pain exploded through my body as I crashed into the counter, gasping for breath. Jake loomed over me, his grin wild, eyes gleaming with amusement. "You got some fight in you," he muttered, wiping blood from his split lip. "I like that." He raised the knife. I reacted on instinct. My hands shot forward, grabbing his wrist before the blade could come down. We struggled, muscles straining, my breath coming in ragged bursts. His strength was unreal. He was pushing the knife closer, closer. Desperate, I slammed my knee into his stomach. He grunted, faltering for just a second. It was all I needed. I wrenched the knife from his grip and drove it into his leg. Jake let out a choked laugh as he collapsed to one knee. Blood soaked into his jeans, dark and spreading. But he was still smiling. "You think this is over?" he rasped, breathing heavy, eyes locked onto mine. I didn't answer. I was already reaching for the gun. I didn't wait. I didn't check if Jake was still breathing. I grabbed the gun. Useless or not, I wasn't leaving it behind, and staggered out of the camper, nearly tripping over my own feet. My body screamed in protest, every muscle aching, but adrenaline kept me moving. The desert stretched ahead, endless and silent, but I knew where I had to go. My car. It wasn't far. I'd barely made it half a mile before he caught up. I sprinted. Behind me, the camper door groaned in the wind. A distant coyote howled, but there was no sound of pursuit. No footsteps. Still, I didn't stop running. The night air burned my throat, and my legs felt like lead. But then, finally, I saw it. My car sat exactly where I'd left it, half covered in dust, waiting like salvation itself. I yanked the door open, shoved the gun onto the passenger seat, and jammed the key into the ignition with shaking hands. The engine sputtered. "Come on, come on." It roared to life. I slammed my foot on the gas, tires spinning in the dirt before catching traction, the car lurching forward. The headlights cut through the darkness, revealing the empty desert road. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I drove like hell, my hands gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. My mind raced as fast as the car, replaying every second of what had happened, every red flag I had ignored. The gas station came into view, a glowing beacon in the distance, but I didn't stop. I shot past it, my only focus on getting to civilization, to safety. It was nearly an hour before I saw the first signs of a town. A lone diner, a couple of darkened houses. Then, finally, a police station. I pulled up fast, barely remembering to throw the car into park before stumbling inside. The officer at the front desk looked up, startled. I was attacked, I gasped. A man in the desert. He tried to kill me. The words tumbled out, incoherent and frantic. The officer's expression shifted from confusion to concern, and within minutes, I was sitting in a dimly lit office, recounting everything. The chase, the trailer, the skull, the fight, Jake. They sent out a search team immediately. I stayed in town overnight, too shaken to even think about driving again. The next morning, the sheriff himself came to my motel room. His expression was grim. "We found the camper," he said. I sat up, pulse quickening. "And Jake?" The sheriff shook his head. "Blood, signs of a struggle, but no body." The words sent ice through my veins. "He's gone?" I asked, barely above a whisper. The sheriff nodded. "We also found other things." He didn't elaborate. He didn't have to. I already knew. Jake had done this before, and now he was out there. Still, somewhere. I went home, but I was never the same. I used to love the open road. The thrill of driving for hours, just me and the world. Now, the thought of being alone on a highway made my stomach turn. I stopped traveling, stopped filming. I triple-locked my doors at night, slept with a bat next to my bed, and the nightmares, they never stopped. Sometimes I'd dream I was back in the desert, running, with no end in sight. Other nights, I'd wake up in a cold sweat, hearing that same slow, eerie whistling outside my window. But the worst ones, the ones that left me lying awake until sunrise, were the ones where I never made it out, where Jake caught me, where the game didn't end. And every time, just before I woke up, I'd hear his voice in the dark, whispering, "You think this is over?" I never thought I would sign up for something like this. A week-long retreat deep in the Oregon wilderness, completely off-grid. No phone, no emails, no late-night doom scrolling. It sounded like a dream to my overworked, burnt-out brain. At least, that's what I told myself. The truth was, I had been unraveling for months. Anxiety had become a permanent fixture in my life, wrapping around me like a second skin. The pressure at work was relentless. Deadlines blurred into each other. I slept in 2-hour increments, waking up with my heart pounding for no reason. My friend Hannah saw the cracks before I did. She was the one who recommended the retreat. "It's supposed to be amazing," she had gushed. "Total disconnection. Deep healing. People say it changes your life." I wasn't sure I believed in that kind of thing, spiritual healing, energy cleansing, or whatever they called it. But at that point, I was willing to try anything. So, there I was, standing outside the main lodge of Evensong Retreat Center, surrounded by towering fir trees and the damp chill of late autumn. The air smelled of pine and earth, clean and crisp. A light mist clung to the ground, swirling around my boots as I took in my surroundings. The retreat center was small and rustic, consisting of a handful of wooden cabins, a communal dining hall, and a larger structure that looked like a ceremonial space of some kind. Everything was nestled deep in the woods, so remote that even the drive there had made me uneasy. Miles of unpaved roads winding through dense forest, no cell service, no sign of civilization. Despite its beauty, there was something unsettling about the place. It felt too quiet, as if the trees were listening. A man approached me as I stood outside the lodge, his smile too wide, his eyes a little too knowing. "Welcome to Evensong," he said. "You must be Mia." I nodded, shifting my bag on my shoulder. "Yeah, first time at something like this." His name tag read Elijah, and he was dressed in simple, earth-toned clothes, his demeanor calm in a way that felt almost rehearsed. "We're so glad you're here," he said. "This is going to be a profound experience for you." I followed him inside, where a few other guests were checking in. The interior was warm and dimly lit, with the scent of burning sage in the air. A wooden table held a stack of papers, and Elijah handed me one. "Just a quick formality," he said. I scanned the waiver, most of it the usual legal jargon, release of liability, acknowledgement of the program's guidelines. But one clause stood out. "Leaving before the retreat concludes is prohibited." I frowned. "What does this mean?" Elijah's smile didn't falter. "It's just a precaution. This is an immersive experience, and sudden departures can be disruptive to yourself and others. We encourage full commitment." I hesitated. The wording felt off. Prohibited? That was a strong word. But then I reminded myself why I was here. I needed this. A week without stress, without work, without the constant buzz of my phone. So I signed my name. And with that, there was no turning back. I wasn't prepared for the strictness of the schedule. On the first morning, a loud chime woke me at 4 a.m. sharp. I had barely slept. The air inside the cabin was freezing, the thin blankets offering little warmth. My body felt heavy, sluggish, but I forced myself up, dressing in the simple linen clothes they had provided us upon arrival. Outside, the retreat center was swallowed in darkness, the towering trees looming like silent sentinels. The only sources of light were dim lanterns placed along the paths, casting flickering shadows. I followed the other participants, about a dozen of us in total, to the main lodge, where we sat in a circle on thin mats for morning meditation. The first 2 hours were spent in silence, our breathing controlled, our bodies rigid as we followed the slow, rhythmic instructions of the retreat leader. My thoughts, however, refused to settle. Why did I feel so drained already? It was as if all my energy had been siphoned out overnight. Breakfast was a small bowl of porridge and a cup of herbal tea, which had an earthy, slightly bitter taste. "The food is designed to cleanse toxins from your body," Elijah explained, watching as we ate. His presence made me uneasy. He and the other staff members were always watching, their eyes scanning the room as if making sure no one resisted the program. We were not allowed to speak during meals. A sign in the dining hall read, "Silence is the key to purification. Empty the mind. Let the body listen." I chewed slowly, glancing at the others. Their expressions were strange. Some of them smiled faintly to themselves, as if caught in a trance. Others stared down at their food, their movements robotic. After breakfast, the day was filled with meditative walks, breathwork sessions, and reflection time, which meant sitting alone in the woods, thinking. No phone, no talking, just me and the endless trees. I tried to convince myself that this was just part of the process. That was why I came here, right? To slow down, to reset. But something felt wrong. The rules that couldn't be broken. By the second night, the rules became clearer. No talking outside of designated discussion hours. No leaving the retreat grounds. No questioning the program. And above all, never step outside your cabin at night. Why? I had asked, the first real question I had dared to voice. Elijah's response was immediate. For your safety. That was it. No elaboration. No reassurance. Just those 3 words, delivered with the same empty smile. At 8 p.m., we were gathered in the ceremonial hall, where we were given another cup of the special tea. This time, it tasted different. Earthy, yes, but with a hint of something almost metallic. The chanting ritual followed. The retreat leader, a woman named Celeste, led the group in a slow, melodic hum. The sound filled the wooden hall, vibrating deep in my chest. At first, it was soothing. Then, as the minutes stretched into an hour, then longer, the sound became oppressive. The air grew thick, suffocating. I looked around. The others were swaying gently, their eyes half closed, their mouths moving in unison. The longer I watched, the more unnatural it looked, like puppets being controlled by unseen strings. I felt lightheaded. My limbs tingled, my thoughts slowing, unraveling. I don't remember how the night ended. One moment I was sitting on the floor, the next I was back in my cabin, the air around me heavy and still. By the third day, I knew something was seriously wrong. I had been eating every meal, yet I felt weaker. My legs trembled when I walked. My head swam whenever I stood up. The dreams had started, too. Dark figures whispered to me in my sleep, their voices slithering through my mind like tendrils of smoke. I could never quite make out what they were saying, but the words filled me with an overwhelming sense of dread. Worse still, some of the guests were changing. I noticed it first in a woman named Daphne. On the first day, she had been quiet but friendly, exchanging nervous glances with me when the rules were explained. Now, she smiled constantly, a wide, eerie grin that never wavered. Her eyes had a vacant, glassy quality, like she wasn't entirely present. One morning, I whispered to her, breaking the silence rule. "Daphne, are you okay?" She turned her head toward me too slowly, as if she had to think about it first. Then she just kept smiling. She didn't blink, didn't respond. A cold chill crept down my spine. The next night, when the tea was passed around again, I hesitated. I wanted to refuse. But when I looked up, Elijah was watching me. So were the others. Their expectant, unwavering stares pinned me in place. Slowly, I raised the cup to my lips. I knew, with a sickening certainty, that something terrible was happening at evensong, and I had no way out. By the fourth day, I had learned to keep my thoughts to myself. The exhaustion was worsening. My limbs felt leaden, my thoughts sluggish. The dreams had become unbearable, always the same faceless figures whispering in the dark, calling my name in voices that weren't voices at all. During meditation, I kept catching myself drifting, not asleep, but somewhere else entirely. The chants, the tea, the endless silence, it was doing something to me. To all of us. I just didn't know what. And then Daniel spoke to me. It happened after the evening meal, when we were briefly allowed to whisper among ourselves before the night ritual. Most of the participants were subdued, speaking in hushed, almost reverent tones. But Daniel looked afraid. He was in his mid-30s, with an athletic build that had begun to wither under the strict diet. His eyes, however, were alert. Too alert. I was finishing my tea when he sat down next to me, lowering his voice to a whisper. "We need to talk, but not here." I nearly choked on my drink. Talking about the retreat, questioning it, was against the rules. But something in his expression told me I should listen. Later, under the cover of night, we met outside the cabins, standing just beyond the dim glow of the lanterns. The forest was an expanse of shadows, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and pine. "I've been here before," he murmured. I frowned. "What? I don't remember leaving, Mia." He swallowed hard. I shouldn't be here. But somehow I came back. A cold prickle ran down my spine. "That's not possible." But Daniel just shook his head. Then he rolled up his sleeve and extended his arm. Tiny scars lined his wrist, small, uniform marks, like punctures. I didn't have these before. His voice was shaking now. I don't know how I got them. I don't remember anything past the last night of my retreat. It's like my memories stop. I was about to respond when a figure stepped out of the shadows. Elijah. I flinched at his sudden presence. He wasn't supposed to be here. None of the staff ever patrolled at night. But there he was, standing too still, smiling too widely. Everything okay here? His tone was pleasant. But his eyes weren't. Daniel and I nodded quickly, stepping apart like guilty children. Elijah's smile didn't falter. It's getting late. You both know the rules. We murmured our agreement and returned to our cabins. But that night, as I lay awake in the suffocating silence, I made a decision. I needed to know what was really happening here. That night, I broke the most important rule. I snuck out of my cabin. Moving as silently as I could, I followed the dimly lit path toward the dining hall. My pulse pounded in my ears, each crunch of gravel underfoot feeling deafening in the unnatural quiet. Then voices. I froze, pressing myself against the wall just outside the back entrance. Inside, 3 staff members were speaking in hushed tones. She's resisting the process, one of them said. We need to adjust her dosage. My stomach clenched. She's still dreaming? Another asked. Yes, but she's fighting it. The others are progressing as expected, but she's a pause. She's aware. I felt a sharp jolt of panic. They were talking about me. I didn't wait to hear more. Carefully, I crept through the back door into the dimly lit kitchen. My hands shook as I searched the wooden cabinets until I found what I was looking for, the tea. It was stored in a metal canister, labeled with a single word, devotion. I unscrewed the lid, holding my breath. The scent hit me immediately, earthy, bitter, but also metallic. Too metallic. I didn't know much about herbs, but I knew that tea shouldn't smell like copper and damp soil. I grabbed a handful, shoving the dry leaves into my pocket before slipping back out into the night. I didn't stop shaking until I was safely in my cabin. The next morning, I tried to warn the others. I found Daniel first, pulled him aside as soon as we were alone, told him everything. He listened. He wanted to believe me. I could see it in his eyes. But something held him back. Doubt. Fear. That doesn't make sense, Mia, he finally whispered. Maybe you're just tired. Maybe the retreat is working and you're... I grabbed his arm. Listen to yourself, I hissed. You told me last night that you don't remember leaving. You said something's wrong, and now you think it's fine. His expression flickered, confusion, uncertainty, then settled into something eerily neutral. I felt my stomach drop. It was already happening to him. The staff must have increased his dose. The realization made my blood run cold. I turned to the others, trying to get someone, anyone, to listen. I whispered about the tea, about the strange conversations I had overheard. But every face I turned to was the same. Blank smiles, glassy eyes. Even those who had once looked uneasy were now serene. It was as if the real them had been smothered, buried beneath layers of something I couldn't understand. Something unnatural. By the time breakfast ended, I was the only one left. The only one still aware. And I knew, with horrifying certainty, that I had very little time left. I had to leave. Now, after breakfast, after seeing the last flicker of doubt drain from Daniel's eyes, I knew I couldn't wait any longer. If I hesitated, if I let one more cup of that tea touch my lips, I might never want to leave at all. I formulated my escape plan carefully. I'd wait until after the night ritual, sneak past the cabins, and make a run for the tree line. I didn't know how far it was to the nearest town, but I didn't care. I'd walk all night if I had to, but I never got the chance. At dusk, Elijah approached me in the dining hall, his ever-present smile sharper than usual. Mia, tonight is a special occasion. Something in my gut twisted. We've selected you for the final cleansing. A murmur rippled through the other participants, a mixture of awe and envy. Their eyes followed me with a reverence that made my skin crawl. I forced myself to stay calm. Final cleansing? Elijah nodded, his smile unwavering. It's time for your rebirth. 2 staff members took me by the arms. Not aggressively, but firmly enough to make it clear I had no choice. And just like that, my escape plan was gone. I was led past the ceremonial hall, past the familiar paths we walked for meditation, deeper into the woods. The air was thicker here, heavier. Eventually, we reached what looked like a small stone structure. half hidden beneath overgrown moss. A trapdoor lay embedded in the ground. Elijah opened it. A staircase led downward, into the dark. I dug my heels in. I don't want to. A hand clamped on my shoulder. It's all right, Mia, Elijah murmured. You'll understand soon. The others were watching. Their eyes were too eager, too expectant. And so, with no other choice, I descended. The moment I stepped into the chamber below, my breath caught in my throat. The underground room was massive, its walls lined with carvings, symbols I didn't recognize. The air smelled of damp earth, burning herbs, and something else, something metallic. In the center stood a large stone altar, the surface covered in dark stains. And then I saw them, the missing participants. They sat in a perfect circle around the altar, their bodies still, their heads bowed. Their mouths moved in a silent chant, eyes glazed, faces expressionless. My pulse thundered. This wasn't a retreat. This was a cult. Elijah stepped forward, raising his hands. The staff members had changed into ceremonial robes. Their chanting filled the chamber, low and rhythmic, sending vibrations through my bones. I turned to flee. Hands grabbed me. I thrashed, but there were too many of them. I was dragged forward, toward the altar. No, let me go. My screams echoed, but nobody reacted. Nobody except Elijah. He stepped closer, his eyes dark with something almost ecstatic. Mia, he said, his voice soothing, hypnotic. You have been chosen. The tea has prepared you. It's time to complete your transformation. I shook my head violently. I don't want this. I don't. You misunderstand. Elijah gestured, and two of the robed figures brought forward a large clay bowl. Inside was a thick, dark liquid. The tea. It wasn't just to cleanse your body, he continued, but your mind. The plants we use, they rewrite you. They strip away your resistance, your doubts. They make you one of us. I recoiled. They had been drugging us. Slowly, methodically. Elijah smiled. The final step will complete the process. You will belong. The chanting grew louder. One of the robed figures approached me, holding the bowl of black liquid. Drink, Elijah commanded. I clamped my lips shut. No, no, no. A hand wrenched my jaw open. Fingers forced their way inside, prying me apart. The bowl tilted. I twisted, thrashing, kicking, biting. My head snapped forward, and I sank my teeth into the hand gripping me. A scream. The hold on me loosened just enough. I ripped free. Without thinking, I grabbed the clay bowl and hurled it across the chamber. It shattered against the stone, the dark liquid splattering across the floor. For a moment, there was silence. Then, chaos. The spell was broken. The participants in the circle jerked, blinking, confusion flickering across their faces. They were waking up. Elijah's calm facade cracked. Get her! I ran. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to move. Hands reached for me, but the others, some still trapped in their trance, some now panicking, were in the way. I reached the staircase, lunging up the steps two at a time. A hand snatched at my ankle. I kicked hard. The grip loosened, and I burst into the cold night air. I ran. I tore through the trees, my breath ragged, my body weak from days of malnutrition, exhaustion, and drugs. But adrenaline pushed me forward. Behind me, voices called out. Shouts. Footsteps. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. And when I finally saw the faint glow of headlights in the distance, a road, I knew I had made it. I stumbled onto the asphalt, waving my arms wildly as a pickup truck approached. It screeched to a stop. A man rolled down his window, eyes wide. Jesus, are you okay? I collapsed against the side of the truck. I was shaking too hard to answer. By the time authorities arrived, Evensong Retreat Center was abandoned. No staff, no participants, no trace that it had ever existed. The only thing they found was the underground chamber, its walls covered in ancient symbols. The altar was still there. The bloodstains were real. But of the people? Nothing. I told them everything. They didn't believe me. The official report labeled it as a spiritual retreat gone wrong. No evidence of brainwashing. No proof of missing persons. Just one woman's paranoid story. But I knew the truth. Somewhere, they were still out there. And worst of all, I still dream of them. The chanting never stopped. Elijah stepped closer, his hand raised, fingers dipping into a small bowl of thick, dark ink. The chanting swelled around me, filling the underground chamber like a living thing. The others, ***, dozens of blank-eyed participants, staff in ceremonial robes, watched in eerie, silent reverence. This was it, the final ritual. Elijah's fingers hovered over my forehead, ready to mark me as one of them. They thought I was broken. They thought the tea, the deprivation, the chanting had finally done its work. They were wrong. I waited for the perfect moment. Elijah's fingers pressed against my skin, and I snapped. I lunged. My hands shot up, grabbing his wrist and twisting hard. A sickening crack echoed through the chamber. Elijah shouted, his body jerking back in shock. I didn't stop. My eyes darted to the ceremonial dagger resting on a stone pedestal beside the altar. Ornate, wickedly sharp. I grabbed it. A woman in robes rushed at me. I slashed blindly. The blade sank into flesh. She crumpled, a scream gurgling in her throat. Panic erupted. The chanting dissolved into chaos, shouts, movement, figures closing in on me. I ran. I shoved past bodies, knocking over ritual bowls, spilling dark liquid across the altar. Hands reached for me, but I was too fast. A man grabbed my shoulder. I spun, slamming the dagger into his side. He crumpled. My feet pounded up the stone stairs, out of the chamber, into the night. The moment the cold air hit my lungs, I bolted for the trees. I ran. The forest swallowed me whole, its towering trees stretching high into the ink-black sky. The only light came from the torches behind me, dozens of flickering flames bobbing in the dark. They were coming. Their voices whispered my name. Meow. A deep, melodic hum began, the same chant from the ceremonies, echoing through the woods. They weren't just chasing me. They were calling me back. I stumbled over roots, branches clawing at my skin. The dagger was still in my hand, slick with blood. Ahead, something loomed in the darkness. A structure. An old cabin. Its windows were shattered, its walls warped with age. But it was shelter. I lunged inside, slamming the door behind me. The silence inside was deafening. I pressed my back against the rotting wood, chest heaving, ears straining. Outside, the cultists moved methodically, spreading out, their torches flickering between the trees. Through the cracks in the cabin walls, I saw Elijah. He stood calmly, just beyond the clearing. His smile hadn't faded. He wasn't afraid, because he thought I belonged to him. I knew I couldn't hide forever. I had to end this. I crouched in the shadows, gripping the dagger, waiting. It didn't take long. Elijah stepped away from the group, moving slowly through the woods. Alone. He was looking for me. I slipped out the back of the cabin, silent as death. My heart hammered in my chest as I followed him through the trees. Closer, closer. Then I struck. I lunged from the darkness, the dagger sinking deep into his throat. Elijah's eyes went wide. He gasped, a wet, gurgling sound. Blood poured from his mouth. I twisted the blade. His smile finally faded. His body collapsed to the forest floor, twitching once, then still. The others called for him, their voices laced with confusion. They didn't know he was gone. I used that moment to run. I sprinted through the trees, moving blindly, desperately. Then I saw it. A road. A strip of cracked asphalt cutting through the dense wilderness. Headlights appeared in the distance. A car. I staggered forward, waving frantically. The vehicle screeched to a stop. A man stepped out, eyes widening. Holy shit, are you okay? I collapsed against the hood, gasping for breath. When I turned back toward the forest, the torches were gone. The cultists had vanished. But I knew the truth. They were still out there, and they weren't done with me yet. I don't remember much after the car stopped. The driver must have called the police because the next thing I knew, I was in a hospital bed, my body wrapped in blankets, and four in my arm. My muscles ached, my lips were cracked, and my hands still trembled from exhaustion. The nurses were kind. The detectives were not. They wanted answers. Where had I been? What had happened? Who had done this to me? But I couldn't tell them. Not because I didn't want to. Because I knew they wouldn't believe me. I told them the bare minimum. A retreat. A strange group. Something felt wrong, so I ran. The detectives searched the woods for Evensong Retreat Center. They found the clearing where the cabins had stood, but there was nothing there. No buildings. No ceremonial chamber. No signs of life. As if the place had never existed at all. They chalked it up to exhaustion. Trauma. A delusion. They told me to get rest. They told me to move on. I tried. God, I tried. 3 weeks after my escape, I went back to work. I forced myself to return to normal, burying Evensong deep inside me. I told myself it was over. But then, the symbols started appearing. The first one was carved into the side of my mailbox. A rough, uneven shape, scratched into the metal. The same strange markings I had seen in the underground chamber. I told myself it was a coincidence. Some stupid prank. Then I saw another. This time, on the sidewalk outside my apartment building. Someone had drawn it in white chalk. Watching. That's what the symbol meant. I had seen it before, on the altar at Evensong. A week later, I found the tea. It was sitting outside my door in a plain ceramic cup, still warm. Beside it, a small slip of paper. My hands shook as I picked it up. There were only 5 words. You belong to us now. I dropped the note like it had burned me. I kicked the cup over, spilling the dark liquid across the concrete. The scent hit me instantly, earthy, bitter, metallic. The same tea they had given me at the retreat. I slammed my door shut and locked every bolt. But deep down I knew. Locks wouldn't keep them out. That night, I barely slept. Every sound, every creak of the floorboards, every rustling tree branch set my nerves on fire. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, praying it was over. Then, around 2 a.m., I heard it. A low, distant hum. I sat up, heart hammering. It was coming from outside. I crept to the window, forcing myself to look. And I saw them. Figures standing in the dark, just beyond the streetlights. Motionless. Watching. The humming grew louder. The same chant from the underground chamber. A familiar voice carried over the night air, soft, hypnotic. Mia, come back to us. I clapped a hand over my mouth to stop the scream rising in my throat. I backed away, trembling, my mind screaming at me to run. But where? I had already escaped once. What if this time they wouldn't let me go? The chanting swelled. My vision blurred. I stumbled, gripping the wall, struggling to breathe. And then, silence. I turned back to the window. They were gone. The street was empty. But I knew they had been there. And I knew they would come again. Because I had never really escaped. I was still one of them. And now, they were waiting. Waiting for me to come home. And so, dear listeners, we reach the end. Or perhaps just another beginning. If you enjoyed tonight's journey into the shadows, be sure to like, subscribe, and let me know in the comments which story haunted you the most. But before you go, remember, the dark is never truly empty.